The Louis Armstrong House in Queens, New York, has always held a certain mystery. Neighbors, living in the quiet streets near Corona, would often talk about the sounds that seemed to drift from the old, unoccupied house, especially at night. It wasn't just any kind of music. It was the unmistakable sound of a trumpet, playing the smooth, soulful notes of jazz. Some thought it was a trick of the wind, or the echo of a distant memory, but others swore they could hear it as if Louis Armstrong himself had never truly left. The smell of tobacco still lingered in the old office, where Armstrong spent countless hours writing, rehearsing, and reflecting on his music. It wasn't uncommon for people walking by to notice the faint scent that seemed to float out from the cracked windows, bringing with it the essence of a bygone era. Those who had known the great musician would often smile at the thought, feeling as though his presence was still very much alive in the house. For years, it was a place where the echoes of one of the most beloved jazz legends in history lived on. Visitors, though few, would come to stand outside, hoping for a fleeting moment of connection with the genius who had once called this place home. It was as though Louis Armstrong's spirit never truly left, resonating in the quiet night air and the lingering traces of tobacco smoke offering a timeless reminder of his incredible legacy. Some of the neighbors claimed they had seen lights flicker in the windows, even though the house had been unoccupied for years. At first, people thought it was simply a power glitch, a trick of the old wiring. But as the sightings became more frequent, whispers began to spread. There were stories of a shadowy figure, seated at the grand piano that had once belonged to Armstrong himself, its keys playing softly into the night air. It wasn't just the sounds of music that unsettled them, but the feeling something intangible, like the house was alive, breathing in the rhythm of Armstrong's past. It wasn't unusual for late-night walkers to hear faint laughter echoing through the walls, as if Louis himself were entertaining friends, his voice rich with the warmth and charm that had made him famous. Some even said they caught glimpses of his trumpet gleaming through the curtains, the soft golden hue shining as if it were waiting to be played. But it wasn't just the supernatural whispers that made the house so intriguing. There was something about the air in the neighborhood that seemed different. Those who lived nearby began to notice an odd, electric charge in the atmosphere, an energy that stirred in the stillness of the night. People who ventured too close to the house felt a chill unusual for the warm nights in Queens, followed by the unmistakable feeling of being watched. And then there was the tobacco. It didn't just linger in the office. It began to drift, unnoticed at first, from the house and into the streets, particularly after dusk. It carried a heaviness, a sense of longing, as though the smoke itself carried a memory of things long gone. Those who breathed it and swore they could taste the bitter sweetness of the past, a connection to a man whose music had once filled the world, but whose essence now seemed trapped in the space between the present and the distant past. It was said that if you stood in the yard long enough, you could feel a subtle pull toward the house, as though it were inviting you inside. Those brave enough to cross the threshold, though, spoke of an eerie silence. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to break the stillness. Even the most curious visitors couldn't shake the sense that something important, something unspoken, lay hidden within those walls. But no one could ever quite figure out what it was. One evening, a particularly curious neighbor, an artist by the name of Clara, decided to venture closer to the house. She'd heard the rumors, of course, but she had always dismissed them as just the product of an overactive imagination. Still, there was something about the house, something that pulled her in, perhaps the mystery of it all, or perhaps the way the trumpet's sound seemed to beckon her on nights when the sky was particularly clear. Clara had always been drawn to the eerie beauty of forgotten places, and she found herself standing before the house, feeling the weight of its silence. The smell of tobacco was strong in the air now, and it made her chest tighten, as if it had been lingering for years, waiting for her to arrive. She stood for a long while, staring at the cracked windows, unsure whether she was waiting for something or whether the house was waiting for her. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the window, a faint reflection of someone standing behind the glass. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath shallow, eyes wide. The figure, tall and upright, almost seemed to sway with the rhythm of the music she'd heard in the distance earlier. But it was fleeting, and when Clara blinked, it was gone. Only the empty darkness remained, still and untouched. Her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she found herself walking toward the front door. The lawn, once neatly trimmed, was overrun with wild grass, and the gate creaked as she pushed it open. She could feel a strange warmth now, as if the air itself was holding her, urging her forward. The closer she got to the door, the stronger the scent of tobacco grew, so potent it made her dizzy. Clara knocked almost instinctively. The house seemed to breathe in response, the wood creaking as if it recognized her presence. After a long pause, the door slowly opened, though there was no one there to greet her. The dim light from inside seemed to shimmer in the doorway, casting a golden glow on the floorboards of the hallway. A faint sound of a trumpet could be heard now, so distant it almost felt like it was coming from the very walls of the house. She stepped inside. The air was thick with a musty, old smell, but there was something alive, like the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. The silence was palpable, heavy. Clara's footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as she made her way deeper into the house, drawn by an unseen force. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew that she had to find it. In the dim hallway, she noticed the faint outline of a door at the far end. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond it. But there was something unmistakable about the air around it, an invitation, perhaps, or a challenge. But then, just as she took a step toward it, she heard it. The trumpet, clearer now, louder and more urgent, filling the air with a melody that seemed to tremble in her chest. It was coming from the room. Clara hesitated for only a moment before she pushed the door open, stepping into the room that felt like it had been frozen in time. The space was lined with photographs, old records, and a heavy, dark wooden desk. And there, in the center of the room, was something that made her heart race, a trumpet, sitting on the desk, bathed in the soft glow of a light that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as though the instrument had been waiting for her. And then, as if to confirm that she wasn't alone, Clara heard a soft whisper, a voice, familiar and yet distant, calling her name. It wasn't just any voice, but the unmistakable tone of Louis Armstrong. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the voice seemed to echo from every corner of the room. It was unmistakably Louis Armstrong's voice, warm, rich, filled with the soul of a man who had lived and breathed music. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it was beckoning her, urging her closer. Clara! She spun around, but the room was empty, save for the trumpet and the dust-covered furniture. The air felt thick now, heavy with something unspoken. She tried to move, to leave, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, as though the house itself had claimed her, anchoring her in place. The trumpet, gleaming in the dim light, seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if waiting for her to make a choice. The whisper came again, softer this time, like a memory, like a plea. "Play it, Clara." Without thinking, her hands reached out, trembling, toward the trumpet. It was cold to the touch, yet somehow familiar, as though it had always belonged in her hands. She didn't know why, but she brought it to her lips, and for a moment, she simply stared at the brass, mesmerized by the way it caught the light. The music swirled around her, faint, like the echoes of a forgotten dream. And then her fingers moved, as if guided by an invisible hand. The first note was shaky, uncertain, but the sound it produced was rich and full, resonating in the air like a memory that had been buried for years. The trumpet sang, filling the room with a melody that seemed to come from a different time, a time when Louis Armstrong himself had played. As Clara played, she felt something shift within her, a strange warmth that spread through her chest, like a wave of energy passing through her. It wasn't just the music that had changed. It was the very fabric of the house, as though it was alive, responding to the song. The walls seemed to breathe, the air itself thickening with each note. Suddenly, the room began to change. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and swirled, taking on shapes that Clara couldn't fully comprehend. Figures appeared, hazy at first, but then solidifying, people from another time. There, standing beside her, was Louis Armstrong himself. His face was kind, his eyes twinkling with that familiar mischievous spark, as if he had just stepped out of the past to stand beside her in the present. "That's it," he said, his voice as warm and inviting as it had always been. "You're playing the right notes now, kid." Clara could hardly believe what she was seeing. She was playing alongside a ghost, or was it a memory? The room was alive with music now, the sound of Armstrong's horn blending with her own, creating something new, something that seemed to transcend time and space. The room was no longer just a room, it was a stage, and they were performing together. But then, the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The room seemed to shift, the air crackling with an electricity that made her skin tingle. Clara paused, looking around. Louis was still there, his eyes wide with an expression she couldn't place, as if he was warning her. "Don't stop now," he said, his voice low, almost urgent. "Keep playing." But Clara was hesitant. Something didn't feel right. The trumpet in her hands felt heavier now, as though it was drawing something from her, something she hadn't anticipated. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the air thick with the sound of the music, louder and louder, until it felt as if the house itself was beginning to sing along. And then, from the darkness beyond the room, she heard another voice, a harsh, dissonant sound that didn't belong. It was the sound of a horn, but it was out of tune, jagged and off-key like a warning. Louis's face hardened, his expression now filled with something dark, something she hadn't seen before. He turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You've opened something," he said, his voice low and filled with warning. "Something that shouldn't be opened." Clara's hands froze on the trumpet, her heart pounding in her chest. The melody she had been playing now felt like it was slipping out of her control, as though the music had become something else, something darker. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe, twisting and growing, and Clara realized with a jolt that they weren't just shadows anymore. They were something else, figures from another time, perhaps, or something more ancient. The trumpet in her hands began to hum, vibrating with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Louis stepped back, his face now a mask of fear. "You have to stop," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Before it's too late. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Clara's fingers hovered over the trumpet's valves, her breath shallow and erratic as the dark figures in the room began to close in. The air around her grew colder, a biting chill that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. She could feel their eyes, hundreds of them, burning into her, their gaze both distant and knowing, like 1,000 forgotten souls reaching through time. The very room seemed to shift and distort, the walls warping, stretching as if they were breathing in time with the relentless sound of the trumpet. Louis Armstrong's face, once warm and familiar, now twisted with fear. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the corner where the shadows had begun to writhe, taking on shapes that seemed impossible, fluid, like they were alive and hungry. The trumpet in Clara's hands vibrated so violently now that she could barely hold it. The sound that had once been beautiful, the melody that had flowed from her as though it was a part of her, was now fractured, out of tune, like a fevered, chaotic cry. "You don't understand," Louis said, his voice now trembling. "This place, this house, is not just a home, it's a gateway. And when you start playing..." He trailed off, his gaze flicking nervously toward the growing darkness. "You let something in." Clara's heart raced. She had never believed in the supernatural, never in ghosts or hauntings, but now, standing in the center of this otherworldly madness, she could feel it in every fiber of her being. The music she had summoned had opened a door, one that should never have been opened. A low, guttural sound began to rise from the shadows. It was a melody, but not like any melody Clara had ever heard. It was dissonant, unnatural, and full of malice. A dark rhythm that seemed to mock the music she had played, pulling it into something twisted and distorted. The figures in the room grew more solid now, their forms becoming clearer. They were musicians, people from a time long past, but their faces were not the faces of the living. Their eyes were hollow, empty, their lips twisted in unnatural smiles. They clutched instruments, but the instruments were warped, deformed tubas with cracked bell mouths, violins with strings that stretched and trembled in unnatural ways. One of the figures stepped forward, its face half-shadowed, its body bent at an odd angle as if it had been distorted by the music itself. It raised its trumpet, a twisted, rusted thing, and the sound it produced was not music, but a harsh, shrieking wail that shook the very foundation of the house. The walls trembled, the floor creaked underfoot, and the shadows seemed to stretch, bending toward Clara like the arms of something ancient and ravenous. Louis took another step back, his face filled with desperation. "You have to stop now, before it takes you, too." But Clara could not move. Her hands, trembling and unwilling, held the trumpet, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bring herself to put it down. The music was no longer hers to control. It was as though the house, the instruments, and the very spirits that had once lived here had taken over. The air was thick with the sound of the trumpet, a sound that was no longer beautiful, no longer jazz. It was chaos, it was madness, and it was growing louder, drowning out everything else. Clara could hear the whispers again, but they weren't coming from Louis anymore. They were coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around her. "Play, play, play." The voices of the musicians echoed in unison, their words a chant, urging her to continue, urging her to give in. Clara could feel herself slipping, as though she were being pulled deeper into the music itself, as though she was becoming a part of it, her thoughts, her identity, all melting into the rhythm that now controlled the house. Louis, his face filled with anguish, reached out toward her, but the shadows pulled him back, twisting around him like tendrils of smoke. "Don't!" he cried, his voice barely audible over the growing crescendo. "It'll take everything. Everything, Clara." But Clara couldn't hear him anymore. She couldn't hear anything except the wild, unrelenting sound of the trumpet, the music that was no longer hers, no longer anyone's. The shadows were closing in, and the walls were moving in time with the beat. The room seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural light, as if it were becoming something else entirely, a place that existed outside of time, outside of reality. Suddenly, Clara felt a sharp, painful tug at her chest, a force pulling her toward the center of the room. The trumpet she held seemed to hum, vibrating in her hands, and with every note, the shadows grew bolder, more real, reaching for her, pulling her into their embrace. She tried to scream, to break free, but the music wrapped itself around her like chains, locking her in place. From the darkness, one of the figures approached, its form more solid now, its features more defined. It raised its hand, long, skeletal fingers, and Clara felt her body jerk, as though something was drawing her towards it, something dark, something ancient. Louis, now just a shadow in the distance, reached out one last time. "Clara," he whispered, his voice distant, "don't let them take you." But it was too late. The music, the house, the shadows, they were no longer just things. They were her and she was them. The room spun, the air thickened, and the last thing Clara heard was the echo of a trumpet, calling her name. The room swirled into an endless black, and Clara felt herself falling, weightless, into a space that felt both endless and suffocating. The trumpet in her hands had become an extension of her. Its vibrations now felt deep in her bones, a rhythm that beat in her chest like a heart. The shadows around her, once distant and foreign, now felt familiar, felt like her. But then, just as the music began to drown her completely, a strange stillness settled over the room. The echoes faded, and the oppressive weight of the shadows lifted, leaving only silence. Clara opened her eyes. She was standing in the same room, the same house, but it was different now. The walls, once warped and stretched, had returned to their original shape, though they were worn with age. The furniture, the photographs of Louis Armstrong, everything was exactly as it had been when she first entered. There was no sign of the twisted musicians, no whispering shadows. The trumpet in her hands felt heavier than before, but its music was gone. Louis Armstrong was there, standing in front of her, but he looked different now, his face softer, his expression peaceful, as if he had found the release he was searching for. The urgency in his eyes was gone, replaced by a gentle smile. "You did it," he said, his voice calm and warm, as it had been in life. "You brought it back." Clara, still trembling, looked around the room, unable to grasp what had just happened. She wasn't sure if this was some sort of dream, a lingering echo of whatever had taken hold of her, or if she had truly crossed some boundary between the living and the dead. But one thing was certain. The house, the music, the spirits, they were all still there, but they had been freed. "You opened the door, yes," Louis continued, his voice more steady now. "But you closed it, too. You made sure it didn't consume you, didn't consume all of us. The music, the house, it's no longer bound by the shadows. It's free. We're free." Clara couldn't speak. The weight of what had happened pressed on her. But a strange sense of peace began to wash over her. The cold, the shadows, the twisted forms, they were gone. She wasn't sure if she had saved herself, or if the house had allowed her to leave, but somehow, she was still standing, still breathing. Louis took a step toward her, his gaze soft and understanding. "You didn't belong here, Clara, but you gave us something. You gave us a moment of peace. And for that, we'll always be grateful." As the final words lingered in the air, Clara felt the light shift, soft and golden, as though the house itself had come to life, recognizing the balance she had restored. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place of memories, of music, of a legend. And now the legend could rest. Louis Armstrong took one last glance around the room, his figure beginning to fade. "Go on now. You've got your own music to make," he whispered, his voice now just a soft hum, disappearing like a final note. Clara stood alone, the room still and quiet once more. The trumpet in her hands felt warm, familiar, but no longer oppressive. She knew the music would never leave her, but it was no longer a curse. It was a gift, a legacy. The house, once filled with darkness and restless spirits, had returned to a place of history and peace, where music could live on, echoing through time without fear or sorrow. Clara, standing there amidst the silence, finally understood. It wasn't the trumpet that controlled the house, but the heart of the music, and the soul of the man who had once played it. And in that moment, she knew the story of the Louis Armstrong House had not ended. It had only begun a new chapter. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.